In our first part of the financial modeling practice, we'll prepare the historical financial statements, mainly the income statement, the balance sheet, and the cash flow statement. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go to the raw data. So we're going to use Control Page Down, move to the income statement, and we're going to highlight the accounts that we actually need in our financial model and link those to our model tab. So for the income statement, it's relatively simple because income statements for most industries look very alike. There might be some slight differences, but in most cases the income statement looks very similar. But when it comes for the balance sheet and the cash flow statement, important line items may be different from company to company. For example, let's say unearned revenue. In some industries, in some companies, unearned revenue might be very important. There might be some significant numbers of unearned revenue balances. But in our case, we're gonna ignore unearned revenue because simply it does not exist. Maybe even if it does, maybe it exists under other non-current liabilities. It's included in these numbers. So we're not going to separate unearned revenues. In other words, we're not going to separate unimportant accounts and link them to our financial model. We only want to consider the important accounts and leave out the other accounts and combine them into single accounts, such as other current something something, other operating cash flow, other financing cash flow, and so on. But for the income statement, well, basically we do need revenues. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight the lines where we're going to link it. So let's use Shift Space. We're going to highlight it. So Alt HH. Let's highlight these rows in green actually. So we're going to start from total revenues. We're also going to need cost of goods sold, the cost of revenues. We also need gross profit. The Shift Space F4 is the keys I am using right now. For SG&A expenses, some raw data or some annual reports report SG&A expenses. They divide it into sometimes depreciation or R&D expenses. They might be separated, but in this case they're just expressed as a whole. So we just need this single line item for SG&A, which will lead us to operating income. And then the row we want to highlight is from operating income. We want to get to earnings before tax, so pre-tax profit. And as I mentioned in our Accounting 101 class, there are so many line items in between operating income and EBT. There are so many items that are not related to operations, profits or expenses, such as investment profit, investment expenses, earnings from equity affiliates. There can be unusual items such as restructuring or impairments, things like those. There are so many items that we cannot simply, use all of these items into our financial model. It's simply not necessary. So what we're going to do is we're going to highlight the pre-tax profit first. We're definitely going to need interest expenses. Oh, actually, it's this one down here. This is net interest expense, so it's a combination of these two, I guess. So we need interest expense. We're definitely going to need interest expense and interest income. And what we're going to do is, on our financial model, we're going to just simply combine all of these and treat them as other income and other expenses. In other words, other non-operating income, other non-operating expenses. Of course, in actual practice, we might need to look further into these two line items, which have some significant numbers in between. You can see in year 2017 and year 2020, income on equity affiliates for some reason recorded a very high number in these 2 years. For other non-operating income for year 2017. So in actual practice, what we would usually do is we would usually go to the notes of the financial statements and try to figure out what this was. It seems like that it was a one-off expense, so it's not recurring. It's a one-off non-recurring expense. So there should be some kind of explanation on this on the financial statement. If there isn't, if it's a listed company, usually you can go to the investor relations reports, or some people just go right into the news, and usually there are articles about the earnings results. So you can usually get explanation about these kind of numbers that are outliers. But for now, we're gonna ignore these numbers. We're gonna move straight to interest income taxes. So after earnings before tax, we want income taxes. And lastly, we want net income. So these are the line items that we want to use for the income statement. This is the most typical lines that you will use for the income statement. One more task. This is a small tip for you not to avoid making any mistakes. We're going to make our model from 2018. So historical data starts from 2018. So we're going to link our data from column F. So what we're going to do is we're going to hide these 4 columns just to avoid making any mistakes. So as we learned in our Excel 101 introductory course, we're going to select these 4 columns. We're going to do a control space, shift out the right arrow key, and how we hide these is Alt A H for hide, so that we only have the years that we're going to actually link to our financial model. So let's come back to our financial model. And just be careful not to do it on the EBIT tab. We're using the model spreadsheet. We're going to draw a single line. So we're going to color these cells Alt HH in a slightly brighter color. And this is going to be called the section divider. We're going to divide sections by using these formats and write the names of the section. For example, in this case, it's going to be named the income statement. Control B, and just for aesthetic purposes, the font color to dark navy. So we have the income statement. The income statement is going to start from revenue. So from revenue, we subtract cost of goods sold, which will get us to gross profit. We're going to subtract SG&A, which will get us to operating profit. In other words, EBIT, earnings before interest and tax. Of course, there are definitions where operating profit and EBIT differs, but in this case, we're going to assume that these two are the same. And then for interest, we have interest income and interest expense. And before going straight to pre-tax profit, we will combine all of the other income and all of the other expenses, other income, other expense, into just one single line item, and then reach pre-tax profit. In other words, earnings before tax. And our last two line items would be the income tax and the net income. So simply typing all of the income statement item is not something you would ordinarily face in your actual practice. Usually you would just copy and paste from elsewhere, or you would already have a format in your company that you use, and all you have to do is simply link the relevant raw data. But yeah, just for practicing purposes, because this is in 101 class, we've written down all of the accounts for the income statement just for studying purposes. Now to link everything from our raw data. So what we're going to do is we're going to make a formula. You can use the equal sign or the plus sign, whichever feels convenient. We're going to use control page down to the raw data that we have just highlighted. And of course, for revenue, we're simply going to choose the 2018 revenue. And these are already formatted. The decimal points and the units are already formatted. We want to use, millions. So it's already in US dollar millions form. So we don't have to care about the units. So simply just link total revenues. And what we want to do is we want to copy it across by using Control R. So some students ask, why do we link all of these data to our raw data? Why don't we just simply use copy and paste? One of the main reasons is that this way, even if you make mistakes, even if the raw data is somewhat wrong, you can always track down your financial model and figure out where it went wrong. So for auditing purposes, we always link to the original raw data and try to leave the original raw data to the original form as possible and avoid making any changes to the raw data. Anyway, for cost of goods sold, it's fairly easy. For cost of goods sold and gross profit, you can see that these two line items are just next to each other. So we can use the control down function and then use the control right function, which will make your task much more efficient. For SG&A as well, let's go down. SG&A and operating income, they're also next to each other, so you can simply control down and control right. Unfortunately, for interest income and interest expense, the orders are backwards, so we have to do just one by one. Interest income would be linked to row 36. And interest expense would be linked to row 35. And there we have interest income and interest expense. We're going to skip other income and we're going to do pre-tax profit first. So pre-tax profit, in other words, EBT. And lastly, income tax and net income. So income tax, and net income. And shift it to the right. We haven't done any formatting right now, so it looks very confusing as the data sets are all close to each other. Let's just highlight some of these rows that really needs attention, such as revenue. So shift space, control B for gross profit as well. For operating profit, pre-tax profit, and lastly net income. And lastly, for the other income and other expense line, as I mentioned, we're going to do it as a plug. So what it means that this is going to be the differences between these line items. So we're going to create a formula. We're going to start backwards from pre-tax profit. We're going to subtract profit. We're also going to subtract interest income, but add back interest expenses. If you're not sure that you have made the formula correctly, just you can always check it by doing it backwards. So you start from operating profit, add interest income, subtract interest expenses, and lastly add back other income and other expense. And if this matches these numbers, then your formula should be okay. And in this case, it seems it is. So that's it for the income statement. It wasn't really that difficult, was it? We tried to do it as slow as possible. If you're not familiar with the shortcuts, again, please go to our Excel 101 class and maybe you want to get used to it. Or if you think the lectures are going too fast or too slow, you can always use the speed control on your bottom right and match the lecture speed to your preferences. That's it for the income statement. Now for the balance sheet and the cash flow statement, let's just save the model and come back.